Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by discussing the Israeli far-right march that took place throughout the occupied territories, called the Jerusalem Day March. Now, as we know, this had been postponed, especially, of course, during the latest bout of violence that we had across the occupied territories. This march, when we can look at a lot of the placards and a lot of the videos and pictures that have come out from it, is, for all intents and purposes, a march where a lot of hateful slogans are chanted, as well as written down on some placards as well. In reaction, then, to this march that did take place throughout occupied Jerusalem, then there was balloons that were sent over, incendiary balloons that were sent over the borders of Gaza into the Israeli territories. And there were a number of fires that were started there, and then there was a reaction as well on the other side by the Israelis through airstrikes on Gaza. But at the core of this specific issue, of course, is this far-right march, which had been postponed, as I said. Why was it even let to go through? I mean, I know it happens on a yearly basis, but in the form that it's currently taking place, was this a smart move by the current/previous Israeli governments and establishment? Let's discuss all of this a bit further. We're now joined by Gideon Levy, who is an award-winning Israeli journalist. He's also a weekly Haaretz columnist and author. He's joining us today from Tel Aviv. Joining us today from Jerusalem is Abbey, who is a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute. Alan and Gideon, thank you both for joining us. Alan, I'd like to start with you. For all intents and purposes, this march that took place has been described as provocative. Do you agree with that description? Should it have even gone through?
Let me say yes, it's provocative, and let me also say that the vast majority of Israel, mainstream Israel, as articulated by the new foreign minister, have denounced this rally, denounced this march, have said that it is unnecessary, it's racist, is provocative. So I think that you're talking about a small number of radical Israelis who have been empowered perhaps by the previous Israeli administration and quite frankly, unfortunately, a few current members of the Knesset. But again,
Apologize, Alan, we seem to be having some audio difficulties with you. Gideon, if you can hear me, let me go to you with that same question then. Was this a provocative march? What are your thoughts about it?
I tend to disagree with Alan. First of all, there is no room for questioning even if it was provocative. Sure, it is provocative. It has no other mean but to be provocative, and provocative toward the Palestinians, obviously. But I wouldn't see it as a small group, and I wouldn't for sure not see the current government as opposing to it, because would the current government be really different from the Netanyahu's government? They could very easily to forbid it, very easily. There are many, many arguments against having this march. The fact is that they were either weak enough or supporting enough, and they decided to let it go. And and here we are again with balloons from Gaza, with the Air Force bombing Gaza, and no difference from the former government.
Alan, I believe you're back with us. I do apologize, we got cut off there. Please do continue your thought pattern, and on just if I wanted to get your response to what Gideon there said. Why even allow this to go through if we know this is a hateful march?
Right. So let me repeat that that this was a hateful racist march. It was, in fact, condemned by many members of the new government, and that it went forward is unfortunate. Now, could the brand new government in its first day in office really made a push when it was literally getting its feet on the ground and the former prime minister was making things difficult for them? He hasn't even moved out of his official residence yet. So it went forward, unfortunately. It was a small number of people. It is provocative, and I certainly hope that as the new government finds its footing and gets going, that it will be different from the previous government. I would have to disagree with Gideon Levy, in fact, that even though the current prime minister is nominally considered a right-winger, now that he's in office with a very broad coalition to appease, I don't see him taking provocative moves, and I don't see him encouraging the ultra-nationalists the way Netanyahu did.
Okay, so Gideon, and I don't want to sound sensationalist for the sake of being sensationalist, but I'm currently just on my screen watching a video of a march, and with subtitles, and they're talking about death to Arabs, and how the second Nakba is coming, and then all Palestinians, is obviously the ones who they're targeting would end up in refugee camps again. This is very hateful stuff. What is this? What does it mean that this is allowed to go through? What is the message then that is meant to be received by Arabs/Palestinians?
First of all, the fact that it is allowed says everything. And again, I disagree with Alan because yes, it is a new government, but that's exactly the moment to show the difference. If you don't do it now, when will you do it? It was exactly the opportunity to say there is a new game in town. And this game gives respect to the other people who lives in Jerusalem, who is supposed to gain equal rights to the Jewish people. But they didn't do it. Obviously, they will have more chances to prove themselves, but this was a very bad sign. And the fact that this hatred, this racism is quite legitimate in Israeli discourse says a lot.
Alan, we also have the reality of the fact that the current coalition that we have in the Israeli government, who has been able to form this Israeli government, also includes this Palestinian Israeli party, right? The Ram party, and Mansour Abbas being the head of that. This puts him in a very awkward position too, right? Because, he's part of the government, yet this very government that he's part of has allowed this to go through. Isn't, in a sense, this playing with fire, where if he walks away, then that legitimacy, if I may use that term, is lost?
Look, Mansour Abbas, I believe, is a brave man. He has taken a very difficult and painful step. I'm sure it's costing him a lot in certain communities in the Israeli, Arab, Palestinian communities. But he has decided that being inside is better than being outside and holding on to ideological purity. He and his people will have significant influence on the government in terms of things like slowing down the expulsion of Bedouins from communities and getting some Arab Bedouin communities in the Negev Desert and the southern desert of Israel legalized and recognized. And so there's going to be times when it is difficult for him, the same way there are going to be times when it is difficult for some of the more left-wing Israeli Jewish parties facing some of the issues that will come up. But I think that it's a very brave and important thing, and I certainly hope that he continues to be inside rather than outside, waving his arms in frustration.
Gideon, what do you make of that? Because, I would think that, as Alan there said, yes, of course, Mansour Abbas took a huge chance right now. It's probably, yes, going to cost him a lot within his own, Arab constituents, Palestinian Arab constituents. But, was this worth it?
This is too early to judge. It was a brave step. Above all, it gave legitimization for Arab parliamentarians and Arab parties to participate in future governments. What the coward Israeli Zionist left never dared to do, Netanyahu did for them. And once Netanyahu gave Abbas a legitimization as a potential partner, the center-left adopted him as a partner, which is very nice, but it is still a long way to go. We will face many challenges. The next challenge will be next week, when it will be about the unification of families, of the law of unification of families from the West Bank and Israel-Palestinian families, one of the most racist Israeli laws ever. It must be renewed every year, and we will see who will vote for it and who will vote against it. Mahmoud Abbas is going to vote against it, and by this he creates the first challenge to the government that he is part of.
Yeah. Alan, I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. I know that you've spoken of optimism in the current government, but I wonder, and I know this is an obvious question, but Naftali Bennett has a very clear track record, right? And what he has said about Arabs in the past, that's all on record. How can we really be confident that things will go well?
Well, you may remember, your viewers may remember, or at least they've read in history books, that it was Richard Nixon, a conservative anti-communist Republican in the United States, who in fact made the opening to what was then called Red China and changed the world with that move. He had the anti-communist credentials to do so. So without overstepping the bounds of analogies here, the fact that Naftali Bennett, whose parents were in the United States at the time of Nixon's move to China, has an understanding of that in his bones, that even though he has declared himself a right-winger, he's also shown to be himself to be practical. The fact that he's put together this, been part of this, willing to be part of this broad coalition, suggests to me that he is not wedded to ideological purity. If he were that, he would have stuck with Netanyahu, the ultra-nationalist parties, and the ultra-religious parties. He is facing heat from everybody. He told his children a few weeks ago that he would be the most hated man in the country, and he prepared them for that. He has teenage children, so I'm sure it wasn't easy. Now, I'm not predicting that Bennett will, in fact, make a move the way Nixon did. I'm just saying that at the moment where Gideon Levy sees a glass half full, I'd prefer to see the glass, excuse me, he prefers to see the glass as half empty or three-quarters empty. I prefer to see the glass as half full.
All right, we'll leave it there at that. But we really appreciate both Alan and Gideon for taking their time out today, for speaking to us about this Jerusalem Day March and the consequences of it. The videos are truly disturbing coming out of it. The fact that you would have such hateful speech allowed to be spouted out quite openly and seemingly without any consequence, at least legal or otherwise, from any Israeli establishment and or authorities, judiciary or otherwise. That then, of course, the reaction that we had then coming out from Gaza through incendiary balloons and the Israeli airstrikes in Gaza, all of the above is seemingly a pattern then and to be expected, right? Because this Jerusalem Day March does occur on a yearly basis. Why even allow for such a hateful march if you do claim that you are accepting of everybody, that you're the only democracy in the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera? Those credentials really do not make sense in the face of allowing for such hate to be spouted out on your own streets of your own cities. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss that all-important Biden-Putin summit, which took place yesterday in Geneva. Both leaders saying that the talks were fairly constructive, speaking about the positive atmosphere in the talks, despite the two countries' vast differences on some very key issues, such as human rights, cyber espionage, etc. Ukraine also, of course. Nevertheless, as I said, both in their individual press conferences, did speak highly of each other to an extent, and yes, also spoke of the differences that exist between the two countries. What does this mean at this time that these two leaders have met? We're coming off of course, a Trump presidency where Donald Trump himself was said to have colluded with the Russians. Is this now a different case where Biden will be able to then really connect with the Russians, or Putin more specifically, and be able to then work through the differences? As Biden said, the United States wants a stable but predictable relationship with Russia. That doesn't necessarily mean a good relationship, but at least a stable and predictable one where they can seemingly work together on issues of mutual interest. Let's discuss those issues a bit further. Now joined by Dr. Robert David English, who's a professor and director of the Central European Studies at the University of Southern California. He was also a Pentagon analyst back in the 1980s. He's joining us today from Spezia in Italy. Joining us from Moscow is Dr. Pasha Sharikov, who is a senior research fellow as well as an independent expert and analyst. Pasha and Robert, thank you both for taking your time out to join us today. Pasha, I'd like to start with you. From the Russian point of view, how important was this summit? A lot of experts have said that Putin needs a foreign policy win for his own domestic political reasons. Is that true?
Well, Putin definitely, well, first of all, hi, thank you for having me. Putin clearly needs certain wins in foreign policy, but I don't think that this can be, the relations with the United States could be called a win or lose, because this is clearly not a zero-sum game. This is a much more complicated diplomatic effort that Russia is trying to achieve. I think that the general perception in Russia about the summit is quite positive. The Russians perceived the event as a signal from Biden to negotiate with Putin on equal terms, not from the position of force, as many Russians call it, and basically establish really predictable and stable relations, which not necessarily mean improving the relations. And in this case, I think the most remarkable outcome of the summit is the restoration of ambassadorial missions in Moscow and in Washington, D.C., because neither of the ambassadors have been executing their functions for the last couple of months. But in general, yes, the perception is quite positive.
Robert, I wonder, during all the hype of the Trump presidency surrounding his relationship with Putin, and now we have Biden meeting Putin and speaking about seemingly working to improve relations to an extent between the two countries. I mean, why is the narrative this different between these two U.S. presidents and their relations with Russia?
No, because in the first instance, they are completely different presidents with a different background in foreign affairs and a different orientation towards Russia. And it's not a simple matter of one being more positive and one being more negative, or one liking authoritarian leaders and one disliking them. It's that one is a serious foreign policy professional and one was a kind of amateur careening around without a plan. And so in the case of Biden, not only is there respect for him as a professional, as a seasoned veteran of international affairs, by the way, has a personal acquaintance with Putin already. They weren't meeting for the first time. But also, I think what's often overlooked is that Biden came into this summit and into this presidency not only highly critical of Putin, the killer, or highly critical of Russia's policies towards human rights and restrictions on democracy and free press. No, he came in with major concerns about arms control, right? Biden is an arms control professional going back nearly 30 years. In fact, over 30 years, if you go back to the era of the first SALT agreements, the strategic arms limitation talks going back to the 70s. And he had made it clear, for example, that going back to 2001, when George W. Bush tore up the ABM treaty and began a major program in national missile defense, that Biden disagreed with that. And he saw it would lead to instability, a new round of offensive arms racing, and probably trigger the progressive unraveling of other arms agreements, which it has. Yeah. Including the INF Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty, and he himself barely managed to save the New START Treaty in the first days of his new presidency. So with all that said, I think that he came in with an agenda of seriously working with the Russians, and eventually that could include the Chinese as well, to get a handle on this looming new round of the nuclear arms race, this era of hypersonic missiles, this era of weapons and weaponization of space that is so threatening and yet so much less discussed than the latest cyber intrusion or ransomware hack. I think that's where they're going to do their best business.
What are your thoughts about that? Because arms control certainly is extremely important between these two nations that have had several treaties in the past, some who they've walked away from for their own respective reasons. But how important is that, of course, for global security?
There's arms control agreements and the guarantees that nuclear weapons are not going to be used is very important, super important, and that should be the priority for Russian-American relations years ahead. But I wanted to make a little point about basically the transformation of American approach towards Russia, because when in 2008 Obama and Medvedev were both presidents, and there was, some sort of an effort from the United States, an effort to engage Russia into the democratic processes. And in 2012, President Putin returned as the president of Russia, which was kind of skeptical perceived in the United States. And when the Crimea situation and the Ukraine situation and many, many other problems bursted out altogether in 2014, Obama still, for 2 years, still tried to get Russia back onto this democratic track. Then there was 4 years of Trump, which were more or less weird, let's put it like this. And right now, Biden demonstrates that he is bringing America back, like he says. He is enhancing the transatlantic relations, transatlantic ties with European allies, not against Russia, but Russia is not perceived as a member of this transatlantic community, but as an opponent. I don't want to say enemy, clearly, but an opponent, a competitor that the United States are going to work with in years ahead. Some may call it the new Cold War. And the nuclear arms control agreement and the other arms control agreement, this is not only nuclear weapons, obviously, is just a way to guarantee that this competition between United States and Russia, transatlantic community against Russia, transatlantic community against Russia and China, or whatever equilibrium you may find appropriate, this competition won't result in a nuclear catastrophe or a military actions. So this is why they decided, to discuss the strategic stability and the military issues as a priority, and that's obviously a good thing.
And there's a whole issue then of interfering in each other's affairs, right? And the reason I say that is because obviously on the American side, there's been talk about election interference, cyber hacking, et cetera, et cetera. The list is quite endless on that side. But even on the Russian side, then there is the argument, I would imagine, that the Russians would put forth, listen, you would talk about media freedoms, but then you've also then labeled our media outlets, such as or Russia Today or others, as foreign agents as well within the U.S. And have limited their ability to hire staff, as Putin spoke about this quite clearly during his own press conference. What do you make of those issues vis-a-vis how these two act within each other's respective territories?
I see them as you just described, and I am not optimistic about any breakthroughs in that area. From, I think, Putin's point of view, and the point of view of some of the sort of traditional great power thinkers, you can call them cold warriors if you like, in the Kremlin security apparatus. When we, the West, America or the European Union, constantly seek to expand NATO into their traditional backyard, right? And we don't just do that with an invitation. We do that with tons of money. And the same with joining the European Union, the same with democracy promotion. There are so many programs that reach into those former socialist countries. And you could say lure them, not the people. Remarkably, in countries like Ukraine, Montenegro, a majority of the public remains skeptical certainly of NATO and often the European Union. But it's a small elite in those transition countries that decides things. And the power of contracts, all the monies that are offered and the business relations mean that pro-Western politicians hold sway. And the Russians don't see that as fair. They see that as intrusion, democracy promotion, which is essentially supporting opposition parties against Putin, against Lukashenko, against whoever it might be. And so to them, I think, spending money for the Internet Research Agency, for bots, for Facebook accounts, for hacking into the Democratic National Committee, that's kind of equivalent in their eyes. And so I suspect that kind of competition to continue because neither is renouncing it. And maybe only we'll see some restraint in the most damaging kinds of cyber attacks, those that target critical infrastructure like the Colonial Pipeline, like the Russian power grid. Those are both at risk as well. And that's just too dangerous. And if that means that the state has to get more aggressive with restraining private internet entrepreneurs, hackers, even though the state might not be sponsoring them, they have to crack down on their activities or else risk major reprisals from the West.
I'm going to interrupt you, Robert, just because we're running time. I do sincerely apologize for cutting into your words there, but I wanted to give Pasha, if you allow me, the final word. Pasha, on that point that Robert there was just making a very pertinent one about obviously cybersecurity, that's extremely important for both sides, isn't it? Do you think that they'll be able to work that out and ensure then that either of them are not attacking the other in that regard?
Well, hopefully, but the problem with cybersecurity is both Putin and Biden stick to very, very different, basically opposite vision of the issue. So Putin still claims that the United States interfere with Russian domestic affairs, denying that Russia had anything to do with the interference into American elections, and absolutely vice versa, literally vice versa. Biden accuses Putin of interfering, and he was very, very vocal during his press conference, saying that we cannot afford using these technologies because these are the technologies that we are fighting against, and we cannot give this particular example. So it will be a very, very long work ahead, just formulating what is the problem and formulating some common issues, common interests in this particular sphere. I have lots of ideas, but that's for a different program. Please invite me to talk about it.
Indeed, definitely. We will definitely discussion. We really appreciate both Robert and Pasha for taking their time out of their no doubt busy schedules to share their expertise with us. As I said, in a highly important meeting that took place yesterday in Geneva between President Biden and Putin of Russia and the United States, respectively. The first meeting after Biden has become president, not the first meeting, of course, between Biden and Putin, who Biden especially has been a career diplomat and has met Putin a number of times in the past. What will this now mean going forward? Biden insisted that a face-to-face meeting was the way to go, that diplomacy is the way to go with Russia. Will that then work out for both sides' benefit? A lot of issues seemingly they were able to discuss openly, but in a courteous atmosphere, and that in and of itself, possibly on many people's part, would seem like progress, especially after the Trump years and accusations of his collusion with the Russians to remain in office and to be in office to begin with as well. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in the final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss NATO. And as an alliance, it has come under a lot of criticism, and this is not new criticism, certainly, on the Russian point of view, or in the Russian point of view, I should say. In fact, ever since the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, NATO's entire purpose comes under question. Because why does NATO exist at this time? Is it just existing to, quote unquote, keep Russia under control, as the Russians would so say? NATO, of course, has added significant numbers of member states ever since the Cold War ended and ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And there's always then the issue of the internal NATO squabbles as well, right? I mean, that came out very clearly during the Trump years, and that specifically comes down to the defense budgets and how much the other member states, apart from the United States, then spend on NATO defense spending overall. Let's discuss those issues and, of course, NATO involvement around the world as well in places like Iraq and Afghanistan further with our esteemed panelists who are joining us today. We're joined now by Ron Keller, who is an international advisor. He's also the ex-Netherlands ambassador to Ukraine, Russia, Turkey, and China. He's joining us today from The Hague. Joining us this morning from London, Ontario, is Dr. Erika Simpson, who is the president of the Canadian Peace Research Association. She's also author of the book NATO and the Bomb, and she is an ex-NATO research fellow. Erika and Ron, thank you both for taking your time out to join us today. Erika, let me start with you. I'm going to ask a very basic question. What purpose do you believe NATO serves right now?
You framed it very nicely to say that it is, in a way, to deter Russia, but it's also to have a talk shop with Germany. Remember that NATO was founded in 1949, and so they were concerned about a resurgence of Germany. It's also there to harness the United States, and that's what Canada, we don't want to be in a bilateral arrangement with the United States. We want to be in a multilateral arrangement. So we want to have a talk shop. It's a very expensive talk shop. It's enlarged, as you mentioned. Now it's 30 nations, so they're all European and North American nations, but it doesn't include Mexico or New Zealand or Australia. And so those are countries that in the NATO summit, the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, hinted that they would not expand and not enlarge, but that they would form more partnerships with countries in Asia Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, and maybe even Latin America and Africa.
Ron, you know, what's said a lot about NATO is that this is essentially a medium for the U.S. to get its way around the world. Is that a fair accusation?
Well, yes and no. Let me expand a little bit on that. On your previous question, is NATO there to contain Russia? The answer is, again, yes and no. I mean, the background of NATO, and actually still the reason for NATOs to exist, is to, after two enormously tragic lessons of world wars, to foster peace in Europe. And this alliance that emerged formally in 1949, that's true. But of course, the background is not to contain anybody, but simply to prevent a third world war, another European war. Europe is the source of these world wars, has been the source of tensions between France and Germany. A couple of times the US and others had to come to the rescue of the democratic forces in Europe. And it is only logical that the parties got together and said, we never want a European war anymore. Now, this security drive has resulted in the most successful security alliance the world has ever seen. Never in its 70 years of history, any of the NATO member countries' security was threatened like in those world wars. So a lot of things happened in the 70 years, but NATO serves all its member states. I mean, the Netherlands people have no concern about going to war simply because we feel we are protected in NATO. This feeling of being protected is unbelievably important for any NATO member and for each of the citizens in NATO countries.
Mm. Okay, so Erika, the issue of defense spending, you know that very well. Of course, it came out in the open during the Trump years. Still is an issue. The Americans, I would imagine, are still talking about that through Biden, but probably in a more diplomatic fashion. What do you make of that whole issue? I mean, in a sense, does that also then prove that it's actually the Americans who run the organization, so to speak?
I think that the fact that the U.S. is the hegemon and runs NATO was proven in April when the United States announced Joseph Biden decided to pull out of Afghanistan. And he made that unilateral decision, and Germany, which had opposed the decision under Trump and had said to stay, Germany then followed suit, as did Italy. So Germany and Italy are pulling out of Afghanistan, and it's going to be a bloodbath. It might not be a bloodbath this summer, but it will be this fall. And so I'm concerned when people like Ron Keller say, well, it's an insurance plan. It's an extremely expensive insurance plan. Every country is expected to spend 2% of its gross domestic product on military spending. That's a huge amount of money. We will never reach the UN sustainable goals. We will never be able to provide for every person in Pakistan and India a basic right to life, a basic right to clean water, the same in Canada with our Indigenous people. We cannot afford to spend that much money, and Canada over years and decades has not spent 2%. We did in the 1950s, but even now, after the pressure from President Trump, where President Trump publicly admonished our Prime Minister Trudeau on the world stage, we have still not got up to 2%. We're at 1.47%, which we think is great. And that's enough. We don't need to be a war horse. We don't need to spend billions of dollars on military to sustain our security. So it's a myth. And when we hear people like Ron Keller, who just told us that we haven't had a war in Europe because of NATO, we haven't had a war in Europe for 70 years. We don't know why. Is it because of deterrence? Deterrence works with nuclear weapons? Yeah, or maybe it's just that the Europeans are sick of war and that generations are tired of war. And so they go to NATO and they go to the OSCE and they talk and they have dialogue. And it's interesting that yesterday, Putin and Biden together, they are saying that we're going to have what's called a strategic stability dialogue. And that's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see that in India and Pakistan, more dialogue. Dialogue, that's less expensive.
Ron, what are your thoughts about that? Of course, I want to give you a chance to respond. I mean, there is that argument that's made. I mean, Erika put that very well, where it is said that NATO is just overly militaristic for even its own good, and that, for example, as she correctly pointed out, what we saw yesterday in Geneva with Biden and Putin meeting, two men who disagree on a lot, certainly, but yet they were able to meet and peacefully talk things out like two mature men. That's actually the better way to go.
Sure, of course, talking is a million times better than building war machines. There's no doubt. I mean, just to first of all, I mean, I think that it is too easy to say NATO is just a talk shop. That is not doing justice to what it is and what it costs. On the cost, by the way, I agree with Erika that the 2% is something that is not casted in iron. It should be seen what we need to spend in our military defense. in the view of priorities, including the Millennium and the Sustainable Development Goals and any other, the climate change issues, of course, we need to, I think, I agree with her there, we need to be a bit more flexible on the budgetary part of it. If the threats are such that 5% is needed, then we need 5%. If the threats are such, also in relation to the other priorities that we all face, then we should not see the 2% as a holy thing. That is one. Of course, talking is a million times better than shooting. But Waqar, you said, is NATO overly militarized? Well, NATO is a military organization, whether we like it or not. And of course, I would like, having been responsible for Dutch Development Corporation for 5 years, I know all too well how deeply important resources can be spent on alleviating poverty and bringing sustainable development. I wish we could do that. But as long as we have military threats or other threats or security threats, then each society needs to cater for that. Unfortunately, that is an issue. Then on the question of over-militarized and talking, bear in mind, after the Second World War, the world community learned some lessons. The most important one is that we set up the United Nations with all its bodies and all its frameworks. This had only one purpose, that we do not want another world war. We talk to each other as nations. We peacefully settle disputes. We work together economically. I mean, that has all been set up. That is the most valuable thing mankind has ever built up. Unfortunately, it was still felt to be needed to also set up a military organization. I wish it could be abolished tomorrow, but then let's do it globally. Let's abolish weapons globally. But unfortunately, we know that is not possible. So it is a necessary evil, but it's not something that is high on anybody's priority list.
Okay, Erika, we're quickly running out of time, so I want to give you the final word. There's been talk, Erika, as you very, very well know, on the European side, especially during the Trump years, but I think even before that possibly, that the Europeans wanted to take a handle of their own, quote-unquote, national security, so to speak, and they wanted to, break away in some ways from NATO, not necessarily leave NATO, but, take more of the handle of their own security into their own hands. Is that then the way to go? I mean, if we are simply just talking about national security and military abilities, should every nation be handling its own security in that sense and not depending on NATO?
No, that's a good question. I think it's a gross simplification to say that people who want to spend more money on development want to abolish NATO. We don't want to abolish NATO. People in Canada are not saying, let's get out of NATO. Most people are not saying that. They're saying that we should have a seat at the table. We should have more dialogue. And on the question of Europe and another European war, and should we spend more to stop the Europeans from fighting each other, I am of the opinion that NATO is the most powerful alliance in the world, the most expensive, but maybe not the most successful. So we've seen lots of other plans, like the Marshall Plan, that was very helpful for preventing war. We saw the development of the European Union. That was also extremely important. So we can't give NATO all of the credit for stopping and preventing war. And then finally, on your last point, I know I need to be quick. The French did say they wanted to have their own independent strike force, which they do still have in NATO, their own, and Britain has the Trident. So they still have their own independent capabilities. There's no question. Nuclear capabilities, the Brits could blow up the entire Russia on their own. They're not going to.
All right, we'll have to do that, but we really appreciate both Erika and Ron for taking their time out today and for sharing their thoughts with us about NATO. It's been an organization and an alliance that's been criticized a lot, and we showed there, and we were able to talk then about the differences that even our panelists had about NATO and the good/bad it does around the world, the military spending, the lack of dialogue and the dialogue. I mean, they both are side by side. So the arguments both for and against NATO are quite vast and important. And again, as even Erika there said, it's not like even NATO member states are saying they want to walk away from it, but they are, a lot of them at least, and their peoples are saying that NATO needs to change the way it functions. And that, of course, is an important point as well. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks very much for watching.